Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, all of you, to this policy exchange event on a better alternative to the Climate Change Act. Can I start by thanking the Institute for Government for hosting us this evening in a wonderful, wonderful building. It's absolutely true on this occasion to say that our guest this evening needs no introduction. Quite often when you're introducing someone, you have to sort of scrape it out and see if anyone said anything nice about them. In Bjorn's case, if you look on the internet, it's very difficult not to find anything. So he's not a single list of sort of global public intellectuals or the world's most influential people that he doesn't appear on. In fact, only this week, I think Foreign Policy named him as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And with good reason as well. I think Bjorn has brought in his various books some extremely important thinking, particularly about cost effectiveness, to the environmental debate, which I think is too often lack that kind of thinking. Many of you will have read his books, The Skeptical Environmentalist, or more recently, Cool It. Unlike most policy wonks, Bjorn has just had the pleasure of having his book, Cool It, turned into a Hollywood movie. He's very jealous he's producing. Most of us labouring away in policy wonkery never get to go to Hollywood. But we also meet this evening at a really the perfect time in terms of the discussion about the climate, not in terms of the snow bringing on the traditional British despairing debate about why we can't cope with a centimetre of snow, but because of what's happening today in Cancun, in particular, the Japanese government's decision to really walk away actually from a lot of the key thinking behind the Kyoto approach, perhaps signalling really quite a radically different approach to global carbon negotiations in the future. So a fascinating moment for our speaker to arrive at. He's going to speak for, I think, about half an hour and present to us, and then we're going to have some time for questions and answers. So without any further from me, Bjorn, it's a total pleasure to have you here this evening. Thank you for braving the snow.
Thank you very much. And yes, I am basically just going to give you the short outline of the film. In a sense, it's going to be a little more boring than the film. The basic idea is how I think we should start talking about climate in a very different way, and I would definitely hope, I'm not going to presume to be able to give very specific inputs on what should the British government be doing right now, but I hope that that's what we can have a discussion on afterwards. Clearly, what I've been looking at is how do we get better climate policies. But before we do that, it strikes me that it is perhaps important to say, there's a tendency when we do climate discussions, we jump right into, so how are we going to cut carbon emissions? And it strikes me that maybe we should just remember what is it we're trying to do. Well, it's create a better world. And I think there is a strong dichotomy between feeling good and doing good. And most of the climate policies that we do today have the sense of being fashionable rather than rational, being something that makes us feel good. Put out a lot of solar panels on German medieval churches. It makes us feel like we're really doing something, but honestly, it doesn't really do all that much. Germany famously spending $75 billion in extra subsidies on solar panels, the most of the world. And the net effect will be to postpone global warming by 7 hours by the end of the century. That's not a good policy. We got to ask ourselves, is this just something we do to reaffirm how good people we are, or whether we're actually going to do something that'll fix global warming? And the second point is, and I think that's just as important, and that's a big part of the film, is really also to remove many of our myths around global warming. There's this sense that it's the end of the world and impending doom, and certainly it's great for getting attention. Al Gore got everybody's attention. It's scaring, and scaring the pants off of people is a very effective strategy to get people's attention, but it's a terrible place to be if you're going to make good choices. And so we need to sort of unscare ourselves and start talking about what is the reality of global warming if we're going to have smart decisions. And then, of course, at the end of the day, it really comes down to saying there's only a limited pot of money. So why don't we start spending it wisely? If we over-worry about some places, we end up under-worrying about other things, and that has real consequences. That has, particular consequences for third world people. Very often, it's a sort of almost standard point of saying the most vulnerable people to climate change are the people in the third world, especially the poor. That's absolutely true. But of course, they're also the most vulnerable to pretty much everything else. And so it might bear scrutiny whether we could help them in better and more efficient ways as well. And so I helped organize something called the Copenhagen Consensus. We asked some of the world's top economists to look at across a lot of different areas where are the smartest things to do for the world, anywhere from terrorism and air pollution to global warming and malnutrition. It seems, again, an odd collection of things, but of course, in reality, it's exactly the kind of point that I make to say, presumably, what we want to be remembered by our kids and grandkids is to do good, not the particular way that we did good. And this was what came out in the last time we did it with all the issues in the world. They came out and told us that micronutrients is actually the best way to help the world per dollar invested. It's probably something most people haven't heard about, and that goes in some ways to show the whole point. We have a tendency to listen to people who shout the loudest and have the cutest animals, but it's not necessarily the best way to prioritize. And micronutrients don't have any cute animals, and it's not very sexy, but it just so happens that half the world's population lack one or more micronutrients. It's actually incredibly cheap, unlike malnutrition, which of course requires giving people 3 meals a day. Malnutrition, micronutrient malnutrition, is simply giving a vitamin pill, or essentially adding fortifying, for instance, flour or other staples in the world. And that would actually help bring about half the world's population to be stronger and smarter. I don't know, that seems like a good idea to try to do. And again, it's simply a measure of talking about where are we in this. These are some of the best things to do. On the 14th place came energy research and development. That's going to be the solution that I'm also, I'm giving away the ending of the talk, but there you are. That actually is a pretty good way to deal with global warming, and one of the ways that we should be dealing with global warming. But unfortunately, that's not what we're focusing on. The very last came in cut CO2, especially the sort of Kyoto style approach, which is simply an incredibly expensive way of doing very little good. We need to be able to change that conversation. And that's why I'd like to just give you a very brief outline of how I think we should reconceptualize global warming as a debate if we're going to manage to get any traction on this discussion at all. I'm going to talk about global warming, so you have to have a picture of Al Gore, so here it is. Gore and I gave a presentation to Congress a couple of years ago. I'm sure this is the second before he realizes who I am. But the main point here is not to talk, and I think it's important to sort of tease out the morality in much of the global warming debate. This is not about Al Gore being a bad guy or anyone else being bad guys. I debate a lot of these people, and my sense is they all want to do good. This is not a question of our motives. I think most of the people in this debate want to do good. It's a debate of whether our policies are effective or not. That's the discussion that we should be having, and say, we agree that we want to fix global warming. The question is, are we doing it, and could we be doing it more effectively? So I just simply want to make 4 basic points, and those are also the points that we make in the film, with more energy and certainly with more moving pictures, but there it is. The first point is global warming is real, it's man-made, it is an important problem. I think we have moved on from that, and I certainly think that even if you talk to the very skeptical climate scientists, they tell us more CO2 in the atmosphere means that you end up having higher temperatures, and eventually that is going to be a problem. So I would actually say it's on the agenda thanks to Al Gore. Al Gore got a lot of people's attention to saying this is an important problem, and we should thank him for that. I would also argue, despite the problems that we've seen from the IPCC, it's our best source of information. And I'd love to have that debate also later on. I'm sure some would feel somewhat uncomfortable about that. But again, this is not a perfect place, but it's certainly the best that we've had so far. The likely temperature rise is not 0, but it's not, the sense that the world is going to burst into flames kind of thing. It's 2.6 degrees by the end of the century compared to now, and that's a significant change, but it's not the end of the world. If you ask the climate economists, the total cost is about $15 trillion from global warming. That's a significant amount. It was a little bit before the financial crisis, but it's still a big number, and it certainly ought to make us sit up straight. On the other hand, remember also, it's not the end of the world. It's about half a percentage point of the 21st century net worth of about $3 billion. So we're talking about an issue that's not 0, but it's not 100% either. It's a problem, and it's a problem we need to fix smartly, and that, I think, is the real discussion that we need to have. We need to put it into perspective and find a way to be able to avoid this incredibly unproductive dichotomy that we've had for a very long time, that between people who say, especially of course in the US, it's a hoax, it's not happening at all, and the other end, especially of course the Al Gore camp, it's the end of the world and we need to throw everything at it we possibly have. No, it's not 0%, it's not 100%, it's a half a percentage point. It's a significant problem, it's something we need to deal with, but we also need to be careful that we don't end up spending more money to fixing the problem than the problems that the original ailment would actually have costed. So we need to find smart strategies, and that's really where I think we need to move. But before we do that, we have to understand that the exaggerated one-sided arguments that we very often hear are actually very, very unhelpful for bringing action around this in the long run. Now, it's great, again, to get attention, but it doesn't actually give us any good information. This is Al Gore again, and there's plenty of others out there making the same sort of arguments, the planetary emergency. I love this quote from his website: we have just 10 years to avert a major catastrophe that could send our entire planet into a tailspin of epic destruction involving extreme weather, floods, droughts, epidemics, and killer heat waves beyond anything we've ever experienced. I mean, this certainly sounds like something you don't want. And the point is, actually, it turns out to be technically true, but dramatically misleading. Let me show you just, I'd love to go through more of these, but let's just take a look at two of these. He talks about killer heat waves, he talks about epidemics. Let's look at heat deaths, and let's look at malaria. First of all, it's absolutely true that we are going to see more heat waves, and we are going to see more heat deaths. We have some of the best studies, so you can see them down here from Europe, from cross-national study, that indicates for the UK by mid-century, because of global warming, you'll have about 2,000 more heat deaths every year. That's important to say. That's actually a real and serious cost of global warming. The problem that I have with this argument is that obviously as temperatures rise, you're going to see more heat waves and hence more people dying from heat. But likewise, as temperatures rise, you're going to see fewer cold waves and fewer people dying from cold. At least you should also notice that. And we actually have the data that indicates what's the size of this problem. Well, it turns out that in the UK by mid-century, we're likely to see about 20,000 fewer cold deaths because of global warming. And I would simply argue we're not being well informed if you're only being told 2,000 more people are going to die, but forgotten to tell that 20,000 fewer people are going to die. Now, notice what I'm saying here is not, hey, maybe we should have more global warming. Because I'm not saying that this is a better thing than all the other things together. Global warming is like most complex issues. There are both benefits and disbenefits. It happens that in the long run there's going to be more disbenefits than benefits. That's why it's a problem. That's why we need to fix it. But to only talk about one side of the argument is very unlikely to make good public policy. And of course, this actually not only turns out to be true for the UK or for Denmark, where we'd probably also like it, but actually also globally. If you look at the only peer-reviewed published study, it indicates that we're expecting about 400,000 more heat deaths and 1.8 million fewer cold deaths. But the real point here is not only to say that we're being misled in the sense that we're being told of one side of the story, the scary part, but not the unscary part, but also that we're being told the only way to fix this is by cutting carbon emissions. Now, if you remember the European heat wave in August 2003, 35,000 people died across Europe, 7,500 just in Paris alone, mostly old ladies that were left in their apartments. And the argument somehow, they should have died in vain. We should cut carbon emissions to honor future generations of old ladies in Paris. And that sounds somehow morally right until you start thinking about it. Even if you grant the argument that by cutting carbon emissions we're going to see fewer people dying from heat waves than we would otherwise have seen, remember temperatures will still go up. So more and more old ladies are going to die in Paris, but we're going to make sure slightly fewer more old ladies are going to die by the end of the century. That's essentially what we're saying. That's not very ambitious. And surely there are much, much better ways to do this. And the argument, of course, there is. I mean, there's virtually no heat deaths in the US because they have air conditioning. So, if we care about old ladies in Paris, give them air conditioning. I mean, it's not very complicated, and we really ought to be honest about if that's what we want to achieve, there's a much more effective and much cheaper and much more direct way to help people. But of course, also one of the points that we try to make in the film is that a lot of people worry a little bit about this. It's going to lead to more emissions. But there's also a lot of other ways we can do this. You know, making cities cooler. A lot of cities are much hotter than the surrounding countryside because there's lots of asphalt and virtually no water and greenery. But if that's the problem, and if that's where most of the people in the world is going to live by the end of the century, why don't we do something about that? Paint the world white. Make sure that you have more water and greenery. We know, for instance, for London, if you add more water and greenery, you can have an 8 degrees centigrade reduction in heat wave temperatures. So we can do twice as much good, very cheaply and very effectively, as global warming is going to do over the next century. Why don't we talk about those issues? And obviously, if asphalt is a problem, make more light surfaces. It's very, very simple. And again, we could do this by painting a quarter of the London rooftops, and we could reduce heat wave temperatures about 10 degrees centigrade. Again, the idea here is to say both, we're being told a story very one-sidedly to scare us, but it doesn't actually lead to good public policy, because we say, oh, we've got to cut carbon emissions, when indeed there are much smarter and much more easily obtainable ways that would also actually help a lot sooner and a lot more. So again, the point is to start talking about what is it we're trying to achieve? Are we just trying to feel good about ourselves? Is there only one right solution? Or is it about finding the best way forward? And this is the exact same thing when we talk about malaria. Yes, we're expecting more malaria with global warming because malaria will be endemic in more places. We're expecting about 3% more malaria by the end of the century because of global warming. But remember, there's lots and lots of malaria right now, mainly because people are poor. If you're rich, you don't get malaria. Even if you get malaria, you don't die from malaria. But if you're poor, you get malaria and you die from malaria. And so again, what is it we want to focus on? And it just strikes me as bizarre that we would go out and say, no, we've got to cut carbon emissions to help people with malaria. If we just take a look at one way of estimating, if everybody did the Kyoto Protocol, which of course is about 20 times more than what the world has managed to do so far, we would actually avoid about 1,400 people dying from malaria every year. Now, I like that. I want to be part of a civilization that cares so much about people that we want to save 1,400 people. But it just strikes me as bizarre that we don't talk about the fact that we can save 850,000 people from dying from malaria each year by simple malaria-specific policies like artemisinin and mosquito nets. So again, what is it we want to achieve? Feel good or do good? And of course, there's a very big difference in the cost. Kyoto is estimated at about $180 billion, and the malaria-specific policy is about $3 billion. Or to put it very, very bluntly, for every time Al Gore can save one person from malaria through climate change policies, the same amount of money spent on malaria policies would save 36,000 people from dying. And so, do we want to be remembered for spending or saving 36,000 or just one? That's the real problem, and that's the real way I think we should start framing climate change in. Because if we do, we would start having a much more constructive conversation about where do we want to focus our attention. And that's really the third point. Yes, global warming is real. It's often vastly exaggerated one-sidedly presented, and that leads to bad policy. The bad policy is really where we need to attack this, because fundamentally, before we start getting better policies in this sort of Kyoto-style approach, we're not going to move anywhere. And you know, if you look at it, it's almost bizarre. You know, we've known at least for 12 years that Kyoto just doesn't work. It costs $180 billion a year. That's the average of all the macroeconomic models. And the temperature reduction is so small you almost can't read it. This is if we only did it for 5 years. Of course, we've done no such thing. So the reasonable assumption is that the temperature reduction will be on the order of 1/50,000th of a degree centigrade. Wait, we won't be able to measure this. That's just silly. That's just symbolic politics. And yet, we seem to keep on meeting like this. Remember, we did the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And ever since, we've had COPs where we've been trying to make it stronger, make it bigger. Last year, we had the big breakdown in Copenhagen where nobody could really get anything done. And what was the bureaucracy's reaction to that? Let's go to Cancun and try again. And then when that's not going to work, we'll go to South Africa and try again, and then to South Korea. And these are all nice places to go. But at some point, we've got to ask ourselves, do we want to just keep on failing? Do we want to keep on doing the same thing and really believing that we're going to get a different result? Or do we want to find another way forward? Yet, that's not the reaction of Europe. Europe has then said, as we do so often, well, if the world doesn't want to save itself, we have to do it. So we've promised to make the 2020 decision. We asked Richard Tull to run all the macroeconomic models and what the cost is of the 2020 policy, which is a lot higher than what the EU has said. The average is about $250 billion per year throughout the century. And the net benefit is that it'll lower temperatures by 20th of 1 degree centigrade if we do this all the way through the 21st century. So essentially, spending $20 trillion, and by the end of the century, we won't even be able to measure the difference. There's something wrong here. If we do the economic calculations, we actually estimate, and I think this is a very useful way to sort of make a measure or a sort of efficacy evaluation. For every dollar spent, we avoid about 3 cents of climate damage, or to put it differently, or equivalently, for every pound spent, we will avoid 3 pence of climate damage. But the idea is to say it's a very poor policy. We actually get very little out of this. And so we got to ask ourselves, is this really the best way to spend $250 billion? We actually make this the center point of the film in terms of saying this is really the only climate policy on the books right now. We're going to spend $250 billion on doing no good 100 years from now. Is there a better way forward? And the answer is yes, and I'll get back to that in a second. But notice in Copenhagen, we also all agreed that we were going to have the 2 degrees centigrade target. The temperatures are not allowed to rise above 2 degrees over pre-industrial temperatures. And if you do the models, and these are all the macro energy models, indicate half of them can actually make this happen. We're just too late with that. But the other half, you could say these are the optimistic half, indicate that the cost by the end of the century is going to be $40,000 billion per year, about 13% of global GDP, if we do it in the smartest way possible. I mean, this is a good reason why this is never going to happen, right? Every dollar spent will avoid about 2 cents of climate damage. And remember again, this assumes that all politicians across all continents and across time picks all the right policy measures, which probably is a slight optimistic assumption. So fundamentally, we're faced with policies that are just not working and that are incredibly inefficient. Yet we keep doing them. And I would argue to a large extent it's because this is all about symbolic politics. It's all about being able to say we're going to do good things and then leave it to somebody else. I'm always amazed by how everybody loved. Do you remember Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2005? Tony Blair certainly swooned over him, but I think everybody did because he promised to bring California into the Kyoto Protocol in 2020, 10 years after you'd be out of the governorship. So he was essentially saying, I can't do Schwarzenegger. I solemnly pledge that somebody else is going to do the hard work. And that's essentially what a lot of politicians are doing. And so it's not very surprising that it's great to be able to say, hey, somebody else will do this. Of course, now California is just worried about paying their bills. But the real point here is we will never get there as long as we keep proposing these incredibly inefficient policies. So what I'd like to leave you with is a much smarter way forward. And before I just do that, let me just give you a metaphor, which I think in many ways sums up the argument. The polar bears have become the icon of global warming. If you see a polar bear, you think about global warming, and they look really cute if you're not close up. But in reality, I think there's 2 things that most people haven't heard and that they probably should hear about polar bears. Yes, polar bears will have a harder time with diminishing and eventually disappearing summer Arctic ice. So there is a problem here. That's true. But one thing is that polar bear populations have quadrupled over the last 50 years, from about 5,000 to 22,000 now. So they're not in any immediate danger. We will have to fix it in the medium and long run, but there's certainly no immediate danger. And the second thing is we're being told, just like with heat deaths in Paris, we're being told, fix it by cutting carbon emissions. But in reality, how much would that do? If we all did the Kyoto Protocol, again, something that would be about 20 times more than what the world has done, we would save about 1 polar bear a year. If we do the models. Yeah, I like polar bears. I'm all for saving a polar bear. A couple $100 billion might be a slight steep price, but it strikes me as odd that nobody has the conversation of the fact that every year we shoot polar bears. and not just a few of them, right? We actually shoot somewhere between 300 and 500 polar bears every year. Now, I don't know about you, but it strikes me that maybe we should stop shooting 300 polar bears first. I mean, not only would it be a couple $100 billion cheaper, it would also be better for 299 polar bears. And that's the real point in the climate debate. Allow ourselves to step back and say, all right, what is smart policy? This does not mean that we don't have to fix global warming in the long run. But if we care about people dying in Paris, maybe we should start figuring out smart ways to make it cooler in Paris, either through air conditioning or cool cities. If we care about people getting malaria, maybe we should start caring about smart ways to avoid malaria. And there really are very smart and cheap ways. If we care about polar bears, maybe we should stop shooting them. And then we can start moving on and say, and this of course is true for virtually everything we talk about in the climate debate, then we can start moving on to say, how should we fix global warming? And I think the fundamental question we need to ask ourselves is, if solar panels, and let's just take that as a metaphor, right now is much more expensive than fossil fuels, we're estimating that 10 times more expensive than fossil fuels, what's the right way forward? Are we going to try to force a lot of people to buy all these incredibly inefficient panels? Or should we try to innovate the price down of solar panels? And it strikes me that it's a very obvious question that we just don't think very much about right now. Fundamentally, as long as solar panels are expensive, a few rich, well-meaning Westerners will put them up on their rooftops. They'll feel very good about themselves. I love George Monbiot. There's a lot of places where we don't agree, but he basically says it's a support for rich, well-meaning Westerners. I mean, not only do we get to feel good about ourselves, we actually get subsidies from everyone else to put them up on our rooftops, right? So it's a way to have a few people feeling really good about themselves, but it doesn't solve global warming. On the other hand, if we could innovate the price down below fossil fuels, we would be done. We would have solved global warming. Everyone would be buying them, not because we have to force them, not because they have to be green, but simply because they're cheaper. And so it seems to me that the only real way to fix global warming in the long run has to be to get technology to be cheaper, to have green technology be cheaper than fossil fuels. Because remember, we don't burn fossil fuels to annoy Al Gore. Right? We burn them because they fundamentally power everything we like. And so telling people, no, you can't have all the stuff you like, and especially, of course, telling the hundreds of millions of people that are starting to become middle class in China and India, no, you can't have that car, no, you can't have that fridge, is very, very dispiriting and probably not going to work. So what we have to be able to tell people is, yes, you can have all those things, but eventually without emitting CO2. But that requires us to have smarter technology. And that's why we came up with, when we looked at the Copenhagen Consensus for Climate, that the investment really should be in research and development into green energy. The Nobel's proposed 0.2% of GDP for all countries in the world. That would be about $100 billion. It's still 50 times more than what we're spending today, but it's half the cost of Kyoto and certainly much, much less than a Copenhagen Treaty or Cancun Treaty, if there even is such a one on the table. But the fundamental point here is to say it's a much more effective way to spend money. And it's one that we could actually argue and reasonably hope to get governments to support. I don't know if it's going to be solar panels. I think we need to make sure that we focus on a very wide range of technologies, because most of them are not going to work. Most of them are not going to be able to innovate down below fossil fuels. But that's okay, because we just need a few of them to work, and those are the ones that will power the 21st century. And the amazing thing is the research indicates that this would actually fix climate change in the medium term. Remember, our current policy doesn't seem to have any promise of that. Of course, there are lots of empty promises, but it doesn't actually have any direction towards that. And the beautiful thing is, if we do the economics, it turns out that for every dollar spent, we would avoid about $11 of climate damage. So compared to the 2-degree centigrade goal, which is the world's goal right now, of spending $1, getting 2 cents back, we would actually do 500 times more good. That's why it got up on the 14th spot in the Copenhagen Consensus. Still not the best thing to do. There's other things we should be focusing on as well, but it's a great way to fix climate change. And so the real crux of the argument here is to say, if we have a policy that's 500 times more effective than the current one, we can both do much more and spend much less. And that should be an easy sell in a crisis and in a financial situation that most of the world's government are finding themselves. Now, there is some discussion about where does this money come from, because obviously this is money that would actually have to come out of government budgets, whereas the other money is mainly in lost GDP growth. But with a 500 times efficiency ratio, there's at least something to what do you say? Like I say? Well, yeah, but there's also a lot of you can have a lot of inefficiency and still get away with it. So fundamentally, global warming is real. It's man-made. We are often fed these one-sided stories, which makes for very bad policies. That's why we need the smarter policies of moving towards research and development into green energy. That's the way to fix this in the long run. And I also promised you a fourth point, and I really think we just need to remember this all the time. If what we wanted to do was to do good, there's many other things we also have to do. Al Gore talks about, and I think this is in many ways the crux of the whole moral argument of global warming. Al Gore talks about, this is our generational mission. This is how we're going to be remembered by our kids and grandkids. And I think that's exactly the right way to frame this. How do you want to be remembered by your kids and grandkids? The amazing thing is Al Gore and many other well-meaning people want to be remembered for spending hundreds of billions of dollars every year to do no good 100 years from now. I'm just not sure our kids and grandkids are going to say, great, go there, granddad. Yeah, when we could have done so much more good. Right? The UN estimates that for less than half this cost, we could fix all major basic problems in the world. We could give clean drinking water, sanitation, basic health care, and education to every single human being on the planet. And so, I'd just like to have you consider, which of these do you think your kids and grandkids are going to think most highly of? Spending twice as much money doing no good, or half the amount of money and fixing virtually all problems in the world? And that's why I would say we should look at the EU solution, and we should start talking about, we're committed to spending $250 billion to making no measurable good 100 years from now. Couldn't we do better? And I would argue, yes, we can. As a planet, we could spend $250 billion a lot better. We could spend, and that's what the Nobel said, spend on climate $100 billion, on green energy research and development. I've not spoken about geoengineering. I'd be happy to talk about that, but if we want to move it along, we also suggest that we should spend $1 billion on geoengineering research and development. So that's for climate. We also estimate that for adaptation, you could basically both achieve cool cities, and you could prevent both inland and coastal flooding for about $50 billion a year all across the world. That would be one of the ways that we show our commitment to current people who are and the close future generations who are going to be hit hard by global warming. That's one of the ways that we could actually spend this money in a pretty good way. I would not say it's the best way, but it's certainly a way to show our commitment to deal with the global warming impacts. And then we could also fix all the other problems. You remember the $75 billion, and for about $100 billion, we could also manage to get food in there. So we could basically have clean drinking water, sanitation, education, food, and health for everyone on the planet. And it just strikes me that that could be a somewhat better moral goal to uphold. And that's the same amount of money that the EU has promised to spend on basically nothing. I would like us to see, to capture both the high ground and saying global warming is real, yeah, it is a problem. Also to say we shouldn't scare people witless to get their attention, we should actually talk about smart solutions, and to talk about what is the best way to fix global warming, which is investing in research and development in green energy, but also remembering that if we want to be remembered well by our kids and grandkids, we cannot just focus on this one problem, which is 0.5% of GDP throughout the 21st century, but it's not by any means the only important problem we need to fix in the 21st century. But this carries the outline of something that could actually give us moral high ground, dealing with global warming, dealing with the impacts, dealing with all the other problems, and saying we're going to spend less money but much more smartly, because remember, this wouldn't be borne by the EU but by the whole world. So I think those were the words for so far. I'll look very much to your question. Brilliant. Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant stuff there, Bjorn. I would be very, very surprised if there aren't any questions for it. If you want to put up your hands, and it would be also helpful if you say who you are and where you're from. I think I know that from gentleman.
Stanley Johnson, I used to be the first EU official who went to the first meeting of the IPCC panel in 1988, and I'm shuddered to think what's happened since then. One of the ideas we floated then, I want to know where it fits into your solution, whether you accept it, that is the carbon tax idea.
Yep. Carbon tax, I mean, fundamentally, I don't think any economist would say be against the carbon tax. If you have a bad, like CO2 is, you should tax it at the right value, that is its marginal social value of bad in this instance. The estimate, if you look at, Richard Tall has done a survey of about 200 of all the peer-reviewed estimates of the damage cost of an extra ton of CO2 into the atmosphere about now. And the estimate is that it's about $7 per ton, or what is that, 4 pounds per ton, it's thereabouts. So it's a couple of euro cents on a liter of gasoline. It's not very much. Remember, the Nicholas Stern estimate was actually the 97th percentile, which also indicates why this was probably slightly off. But the fundamental point here is to say that amount, $7 per ton of CO2 on all greenhouse gases in the world, actually happens to create $250 billion, which is a nice point. You know, it's a coincidence in that sense. But the point we need to realize is our true carbon tax will not solve the problem. At best, it can be used to raise the money to solve the problem. But you know, people are not going to change. We're talking about 1 or 2% reduction in emissions for a low carbon tax. And remember also, even if you don't buy the economic argument, which I think is pretty persuasive, it's just not going to happen politically. There's no way we're going to manage to do this. I think there's one interesting point, though, and this is something Pilk has pointed out, or Roger Pilk several times, that India is actually the only country in the world that right now put carbon tax of about $0.50 per ton of CO2 emitted from coal and put it into research. So they are actually doing it, and they're the only government in the world that does it right now, as far as I know. And that's interesting. It shows that this would actually have a real opportunity if we say it's a low carbon tax and we're going to spend it on finding smarter solutions in the long run.
The gentleman in the very front row here.
Hi, I'm Prashant. I was just querying your book, 250 billion for the solution. I don't actually recognise that number for Europe, but I suspect it's in the view of the investments in renewables. I'm just wondering if you're ignoring the fact that quite a lot of the sort of savings this investment in renewables generates quite substantial avoidance of fossil fuel costs, so operating savings. It also delays the kind of depletion. And I know that sort of PVs are very, very easy targets, but in your own country, you'll find most of the investments, most successful investments, it's actually been in combined heat and power and in wind, which have nothing like the kind of negative kind of aspects you're talking about. I think you're making a mistake in sort of knocking mitigation so much. There's a lot of cost-effective mitigation to the regulation of buildings, in terms of wind, in terms of combined heat and power.
Yes. First of all, it's obviously it's not assuming that would be a very, very wrong way to say, you know, like what's the extra cost, and not counting in the benefits or anything. And also remember, if you, for instance, make a carbon tax, it's not like we burn the money afterwards. We use it, reuse it. So this is GDP loss in the macroeconomic models. And obviously you can have a lot of quibbles with that, but you know, it's some of the best models that we have that seems to indicate what are the long-term impacts of different usage of energy. Most of the cost from the EU, absolutely right, comes from the 20% requirement of renewables. Now, if we just said, let's switch from coal to gas, it would be a lot cheaper. And we still not, you know, we would talk about $98 billion rather than $250 billion. So, you know, the EU has set a bad target and made it a lot worse, which, you know, is somewhat of an achievement, even if a bad one. But I absolutely agree with you that if you can essentially cut CO2 at less than $7 per ton, you should absolutely do it, and that's one of the things that you would also achieve with a low carbon tax. But you should also recognize that is certainly for right now fairly little. Now, there's a whole discussion with the McKinsey Institute, and you know, I'm very, very skeptical of those numbers. That, you know, that there's lots of money lying around, you know, because in a sense, well, why isn't it being picked up? But I think that's a discussion for a different day. I think we sort of staked out that there are those viewpoints here.
Why don't we come right over here?
Jason Turner, Welfare Commissioner in New York City, former Welfare Commissioner in New York City. Anybody that's read the Skeptical Environmentalist is awed by the breadth, depth, and the different topics you address. When you started the project, the Skeptical Environmentalist, did you ever think you'd finish it? And how long did it take? The second question is, I was very disturbed by the Scientific American's refusal to print your rebuttals. I'm wondering where the scientific community stands now as it relates to that decision and others like it.
Yeah. Well, as you probably know, finishing a book is just a decision, I think. You sort of say, okay, I'm done. Or you have a deadline, which is probably a good thing. But it did take 2.5 years. And I love writing those books. Every time I go back and do this kind of stuff, I just love it and don't know why I'm doing anything else. I honestly think the Scientific American, for those of you who don't know, Scientific American published like 11 pages, essentially defending science against me, which I always thought was a slightly odd way of formulating it. But I think in many ways it did exactly the same thing as many, the problems in the IPCC, the climate gate, that kind of stuff. It actually just reflects really badly in science, that there's such an unwillingness to have a sensible conversation. If you read my book, maybe you will disagree with me, but it's very clear that I'm not trying to be dishonest and just trying to say, oh, there's nothing to any of this stuff. And it just strikes me that it's one indication of how there's really only one right solution in many ways, and much of the climate debate and much of the environmental debate has been about taboos, all the things you can't say. And so if there's something positive that came out of the climate gate and the IPCC problems, that kind of stuff, I think we've opened up the box of possible solutions a lot more, and that's a great thing. Remember how you couldn't talk about adaptation 10 years ago because it was somehow seen as almost immoral? I've always felt that that's immoral. Obviously, there's going to be real impacts on people who are living now, and we want to talk about how do we avoid them being flooded over the next 10 years, because nothing we do with climate change would ever have an impact. The good example is, when Katrina became the icon of global warming, it's very clear that if you had been, vice president in the late 1990s, should you have been focused on implementing the Kyoto Protocol or increasing the height of the levees around New Orleans. If you wanted to help the people in New Orleans, it's very clear what you should have been doing. And so again, it's about getting ourselves to talk about all the different opportunities, and we've got a better political opportunity to do that now.
It's interesting in the UK where cutting spending on foreign defences. The gentleman in the check shirt.
Hello, fellow Dane Klaus from Project Crescent. Looking at your the way you modeled as Arnold Schwarzenegger, and you said this is something we're going to deal with in 2020. I'm just thinking a skeptical question might be in order, and your research and development, what's the timeline for that? And is that just a future promise? And secondly, what's the calculations and where do you stand on nuclear?
Yeah. It's obvious that when we're talking about investment in research and development, it is a future promise. But remember, unlike promising I'm going to cut a number in 2020, which you really only start getting really caught up in 2018. I don't know if you remember, Canada actually successfully, they had the COP in 2004, and they kept saying, oh, we're on track. Everyone knew they weren't. And it was really only in 2006, 2007, when they were 36% off their target. They were sort of, okay, yeah, we're not going to make it. So you can keep that charade for a very long time, whereas if you're going to invest in research and development, you will actually see in the very first budget, are you spending 0.2% of GDP? Now, you may not be spending well, and that's a whole different discussion. That's certainly one we should get into. How are you actually going to spend it? I think you should take a page out of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation playbook, have a blue ribbon panel, talk about what are the things we'd most like to see solved over the next 10 years. Very specific, very pragmatic. Who can come up with, I don't know what those would be, so I just like this example, who could come up with the first Hanon solar panel. It sounds like a fun idea. I have no idea what it would be important to do. But the idea is that do X prices for that. Very cheap way to energize a lot of researchers and sort of direct a lot, but not all of research and effort into, I want to be the guy who completes X price 87 or something like that. So there's a lot of ways that you can do that, but I think it's much more implementable. It's because it's cheaper, it's much more likely to happen, and it's much more easily verifiable. On nuclear power, we went to interview Nathan Myhrvold, who together with Bill Gates are working on 4th generation nuclear power plant. They'll probably be building in China or India because that's where you can get the permits. But they're basically promising cheaper than fossil fuel, and it can run off of waste from old nuclear power plants. Sounds amazing, but I'm just reminded of the fact that was what the other 3 generations also promised. Let's see if it works. But my problem with nuclear is entirely that right now nuclear is much more expensive. It's in the order of 2 to 3 times more expensive than the cheapest combined cycle gas power plants.
So one question in the second row.
Yes, Benny Kaiser, Global Warming Policy Foundation. 2 problems I can see is that if you really are serious and take away the subsidies, which are part of the astronomical costs we're facing. You mentioned Germany 70 or 80 billion in the next 10 years just on solar subsidies. If you take that away and focus on R&D, basically the whole renewable energy industry collapses on the first day because they can't survive without, none of the renewable energy is viable without government funding. It's simple, as you said, it's 10 times, 5 times. So the question there is, would any government actually do that? Perhaps if the Tea Party takes over the US, they would do it immediately, completely. So is this on top of the subsidies, or is that to replace the subsidies? The second is governments are currently cutting R&D quite dramatically. They're not increasing, they're cutting. And even where the in Ireland, for instance, they've just doubled the carbon tax to 30 euro per ton. But that money will never be spent to anything to do with green. That just is, they double that because they have a problem and they need money. But the point is, even where you have R&D funding into energy research, we know from the research, it doesn't actually go to anything that makes sense. It goes to the constituency the government thinks is most sympathetic to the government of the day. So for instance, in the US over the last 50 years, 90% of R&D funding in energy went to the nuclear industry. So there are real obstacles that I can see, political and economic obstacles of this actually flying. And wouldn't it make more sense to say, hold on, perhaps we should, instead of thinking about spending these kind of astronomical figures at all, have a more wait and see policy, because after all, we don't even know whether it's going to be colder or warmer in 10 years. Who knows that?
You're absolutely right. It would, if we just took away all the subsidies, it would the whole green sector collapse. So I can't imagine that any government wouldn't, sort of phase this out over 10 years or something like that. There's a lot of practical problems. I'm basically saying this is what would be the ideal solution. Then when obviously it gets into the political machine, it gets less good. Remember, that's true for both of those policies, true for all policies. The 2 cents per dollar probably gets to be a quarter of a cent or something. And the $11 back in the dollar may, because of a lot of inefficiencies, go down to, I don't know, $2 or $3. But let's hope at least it stays above $1. And that's the reality of life. I think you need to recognize that as long as the calculations actually show that this is a good investment, and you can have quibbles with that, but that it's actually a good way of investing in future technology, simply because there's a huge underinvestment in technology right now. A little bit like we see in the medical area. You don't expect pharmaceuticals to invest in medical research that's going to come to fruition in 20 or 40 years. you have governments do that. But what we need to do, and I absolutely agree with you, we need to take it away from special interests. That's one way I think you can do that, by putting it into national science foundations and have it, you should not be funding huge research corporations, if you will, but you should be funding individual or very small groups of researchers much more. And that's one way of at least avoiding these huge white elephants that are sucking up a lot of the funding. My last point would be to say, I think, and unfortunately this is not my metaphor, it's the Breakthrough Institute. They try to make the comparison, and I think it's a very energizing comparison to the IT revolution in the 1950s. Think back on how were we going to get the IT revolution going in 1950? It was not about taxing alternative technology. Right? You didn't get computers going by taxing typewriters or put a cap and trade on slider rulers. And likewise, you didn't do so by buying lots and lots of these inefficient technologies. You didn't say, let's promise a big computer to every British basement, right, in 1960. That would have been terribly a costly way to try to innovate your way out of it. Instead, we did the right thing. We put lots of money into research and development, basically through the space race and military budget. And the point was that brought the integrated circuit, all the other things that made it possible for IBM and Apple to make computers in the early 1980s that we all wanted to buy. And now we don't have to have these, we don't have big meetings where we meet in Kyoto and all promise, okay, we're going to buy 100 million computers. We buy them because they're worth our while. And that's, of course, the exact same thing that's going to happen with green technology in the long run. So I think there's a valuable metaphor in getting people across to say, of course we need to get the incentives right, and of course we're not going to get it all the time. But I think there's a much, much better case to be made, and one that would still pass cost-benefit analysis. And at the end of the day, as long as it seems most developed countries are willing to spend large sums of money on climate, it's certainly a good argument to say, let's spend it well rather than badly.
I think you probably need politically wise. That's a question from my chairman over here.
Thank you, Charles Moore, Policy Exchange. In passing, can I just say I'm a bit worried about your attack on shooting polar bears, because I think that normally with mammals who don't have natural predators, there's a good environmental case for culling, but that's not my question. But my question is, you had the premise that global warming is a bad thing, but you didn't actually say why. Could you tell us?
Yes. If you look at most of the models, they indicate that moderate global warming is going to be a benefit economically speaking, but that's typically because the countries that are going to be better off are the rich countries. They live in temperate zones, whereas most of the people in the third world are going to see immediate deterioration. Basically, where it's already pretty damn warm, it's not going to be better by being a little warmer, whereas, of course, Denmark would probably love it. And our analyses show that we would probably be better off at least for another 50, 100 years. If you look at the global on economics, the next 50 years or so will be positive, and then it'll get more and more negative. And the important point is to remember that whether it gets colder or hotter, although I think the argument is very strongly that it will get hotter in the long run, our infrastructure is built to the temperature that we are used to, and in some sense that we were used to the last 100 years or 200 years, in which case it's gotten warmer, maybe for other reasons as well. But fundamentally, we're already on the edge of our infrastructure capability, and hence, if it gets even warmer, it's going to get even worse. Remember, Helsinki lives fine at 7 degrees and Athens at 22 degrees on average, but they would both suffer if it got much colder or much warmer.
There was another question just down there as well.
Chris Coggins, waste management consultant. I suppose it's a question that links in some of the questions that have been asked and some of your comments. Solar power, wind power, depend on sun and wind. What are your thoughts on the role of waste? Waste management providing a baseload supply of potential energy. The government published, UK government published yesterday, a discussion paper on anaerobic digestion. And there have been comments about anaerobic digestion being contributor to a huge increase in energy from waste, diverting biodegradable waste from landfill and generating heat, energy, transport fuel, biomethane, and so on.
Yeah, and I can't say I know very much about it. And we burn a lot of our waste in Denmark, and it seems to work out fine for us. Again, I would say that that's the exact kind of thing you should put to a cost-benefit test and say, you know, are we going to be able to create energy cheaply? We should do it. If it's expensive, we shouldn't do it. But it's the kind of practical approach that I think would come out of a conversation that was not this ideological, it's either the end of the world or it's nothing at all, but somewhere where we can say, you know, this is a problem we need to fix. And just like all other problems, we'll look at it coolly and say, how much is it going to cost? How much can you build this for? Instead of just making these symbolic policies.
And while we're still in here, another question this side.
Rich Bellman, also Policy Exchange. Your 250 billion figure, as I understand it, is a figure of growth foregone if everybody did what they had to do to meet Kyoto. But everybody's not going to do what they have to do to meet Kyoto. They're not doing it at the moment. Do you have a figure? Can you get a figure for what's actually happening, for how much Kyoto is costing at the moment?
It's important to say this is the EU 2020 policy, which is much more likely to happen. I would actually assume that unless something dramatically changes, Europe is actually going to, you know, commit to this and tie one hand on its back and go around strutting to everyone else and say, see how good we are. And, you know, I can't imagine the Chinese are going to say anything but, cool, you made our oil cheaper. But the fundamental point here is to say, Kyoto, absolutely, we haven't done very much of it, and it's very unlikely that the actual cost of Kyoto is $180 billion, because that's what the fully implemented Kyoto would have been. On the other hand, remember also that's the best implementation of Kyoto, which also would have been unlikely. So in that sense, it's probably a little of an underestimate. But I haven't seen any estimates of what the actual cost of Kyoto is, and I don't know if anyone has ever attended it. I think it'd be a very, very hard task to do. Also because it's so little. You know, remember, it's instructive if you set 1990 at 100 in 2010, this year, we should have been at 142.7, and because of Kyoto, we're at 142.2. So that's what, you know, 12 years of agony has brought us. Not a whole lot of impact.
There's a question from our head of energy and environment. There is a man who does know a bit about how much this is.
Simon Ness from Policy Exchange. You drew a parallel between innovation in the IT sector and innovation in the low carbon sector. In the IT sector, wasn't a major driver the fact that IT did something for you that was new and different? And the problem with innovation in the low carbon sector that is a kilowatt hour of electricity does the same thing for you, whether it's generated by coal or a solar panel. And so isn't there a case for a higher carbon tax, or second best, a subsidy, to bring technologies, low carbon technologies through, at least until they are cheaper than fossil fuel technologies?
Right, I would take exception to the first point. In some ways, you could say it's much harder to see exactly what it is a computer does for you, and that's why there's no cutoff point. You know, it's the Dilberts of the world that probably bought the first couple of computers, but now eventually we all buy them, and I'm sure some people buy them just simply because everybody else have them and you need them, kind of thing. But there's a much cleaner cutoff point in some way with the renewables, because once they're cheaper, they're cheaper. And exactly because it's the same kilowatt hour, you know, let's take aside for the storage issue, but, you know, ideally that should be calculated into the total cost. If it's cheaper from green, that's where I'm going to buy it. You know, so I don't really care where my energy comes from as long as I have it at the lowest possible rate. So I would say it's a very clear cut that at one point, if the innovation is possible, and it certainly seems like most of the cost curves are going down very predictably, certainly not in a Moore's law sort of every 18 months, but, you know, every decade or so, the price halves. And that, you know, bodes very well that some of these technologies will be able to extend that for 2, 3, 4 decades, and then we're there. So no, I would say that it's very comparable, and if anything, it's actually more obvious that we would switch over simply because it's the exact same thing we're getting, only cheaper. The second, and then you can go into the whole idea of it also gives you more security, maybe, I don't know, I think that's a much more nebulous argument. The other one, I'm not sure I understand why it would be an argument of wanting to have a higher CO2 cost than the damage cost, because in some ways that's just that sounds ineffective to me.
If I can come back on that, the argument.
The argument is that when a technology is more expensive, that does something more for you, you're still willing to buy it because of the new thing it does for you. Whereas in low carbon technologies, because a kilowatt hour is the same, however it's generated, while the technology is more expensive, nobody's buying it, and people only want it when it's cheaper than fossil fuel. So how do you get past that long period, as you say, maybe decades, where the technology is there that needs to be produced in scale in order to become cheaper than fossil fuels?
Okay, okay, then I understand. And my understanding of this is we don't want to put a lot of windmills up now. And you need to put up one very clearly to see if it works. You probably also need to put up 5. You may need to put up a whole windmill park or something like that. But don't put up 10,000 of them, because we know how to do this efficiently. And if you take these sort of, how do we bring it to scale? That there's arguments that bringing production to scale will half the cost or something. Let's just assume that that's true. Then don't start mass producing solar panels before they're twice as expensive as fossil fuels, because then they'll get down to parity when you mass produce them. But don't mass produce them when they're 4 times as expensive. That's just silly. We kind of know the technology of mass production, but the idea is, all right, then we'll do that when the innovations have gotten it to twice the cost. So I really think the problem is we want to somehow buy the stuff now because it makes us feel that we're doing something right now. But all we're doing is wasting money. The Germans have bought a lot of solar panels for very little good. And they'll tell you, whenever I debate some of the ministers or something, they'll say, oh, but it improves innovation. No, if you spend $75 billion, of course, a couple of billion is actually going to go to R&D. But if R&D was what you want, you should have spent the whole $75 billion in R&D. And the impact, of course, would have been the Germans would have perhaps brought forth the day when solar panels, I'm speaking incredibly general, and it's not, you can't just do that, but it would have brought forth the day when solar panels are cheaper than fossil fuels from, say, 2035 to 2033. And that would have meant the whole world switching over 2 years earlier. That would have had a much bigger impact. But of course, it doesn't feel that way because there's no photo ops with research and development.
I have 2 kind of related questions to that. I mean, one is, there is an argument, sometimes people say, what we are doing here, this is energy innovation. You create a maturing market, and that is what ultimately drives proper innovation, rather than a kind of centrally driven direct innovation approach. So I wondered if, one question is whether you can expand a bit on your particular view on how you do spend on innovation wisely. The other one really was, in answer to a previous question, you said that it had become, over the last 10 years, acceptable to talk about adaptation. Now, actually, I wonder if that's true in the UK. I think I'm personally very sympathetic to your kind of adaptation and direct innovation approach, but it seems like there's quite a lot of political resistance to that. And I wondered, beyond this sort of distinction you make between feeling good and doing good, whether we could sort of probe a bit more into the kind of psychology of that. I've sometimes wondered, Hayek said that quite often in discussions about the free market, free market is lost out because they said, our plan for growth is that the market will decide things and we'll get there. And the other guy comes along and says, my plan for growth is we'll do X and we'll do Y. And the equivalent in this debate is, you say let's innovate, I say let's build this concrete wind turbine tomorrow, and that kind of, there's something about the kind of the psychology of this that sort of, I think, has made it in the past certainly difficult for this kind of approach to get hearing.
Yeah. The R&D, the fundamental point here is to say if solar power is 20 to 40 years away, and again, I'm just taking that as a metaphor for all these green technologies. If I'm the guy who innovate the price down to half the cost of what it is today, that's a great social breakthrough, but it's still 5 times as expensive. So nobody is actually going to sell anything, and that's why it's going to be very hard to recoup private investment on that patent. You just simply can't get it because others will stand on the shoulders of your innovation, and then there'll be others again standing on those shoulders, and then eventually we'll break even, and that'll be breakthrough. So you need public money. You can't get the private money to do this by themselves. But you're absolutely right, we need to make sure, and I think that was also your question with that it shouldn't just be central planning or that we all end up spending all of it on a few white elephants. But I think we have a very good and well-functioning system in the medical research area. And National Science Foundations in the U.S., I'm not sure what it's called here, but where you basically give grants to what looks interesting, and having other researchers make that call. Now, remember that this works for two reasons. Partly because we would have a lot of different governments do this. So even if some governments go wrong and go awry and get all excited about one thing, but that's fine, because there's going to be a lot of other governments, going off on other things. And secondly, if we did the X prize thing, where we actually have 100 prizes, which would still be a very, very low cost compared to the total cost of what we're going to put into research and development over the next 10 years, it would be able to incentivize a lot of researchers. Not all. I want some to go off the reservation and have wild ideas about this and that. But a lot of them are going to go after these particular areas. But we're not telling you have to do this research, but they're going to do it because they think they have a good idea, a good way to attack, to get to this solution of coming up with the first paint-on solar panel or whatever it might be. I fear it's going to be a lot less sexy than that. But that's the nature of the beast. I think it gets to your point of the political discussion that in some way it is much more sexy to be able to show I care about global warming. I created this wind farm. We've really done something. Whereas just simply increasing innovation, you won't be able to see it. And that is going to be an uphill battle. I think that's one of the reasons why this is not an immediate winner. But again, I think we need to have some people to start standing up and saying there's a cheaper and more effective way. Certainly that's what the research is telling us, but it also has the great benefit of being something that we can implement and something that's going to be cheaper. And I think especially the cheaper argument would have good hearing these years. And so if we could start having the discussion, instead of meeting again in South Africa next year and trying Kyoto again, maybe why don't we say, all right, let's all agree to say, and there's nothing sacred about 0.2%, it could be 0.1%, that's a good start of GDP, and then not all countries are going to sign up, and not all countries are going to actually end up spending all of it. But hey, it would be a great start and a much increased innovation rate. And I think that's the dual argument we should come out with. Say, we're not going to do the EU 2020 policy, because fundamentally we recognize even if we manage to do all of the stuff that we promised, we're going to cut temperatures by 1/20th of 1 degree Celsius. That's just not what our kids and grandkids are going to be proud of us for. Instead, we're going to be spending less money, but more smartly on research and development. It seems to me that that has a possibility of being a winning political argument.
Time for just a few more questions. If you don't mind, we might take a couple together, starting with the gentleman in the grey t-shirt and then the gentleman next to him.
Hi, I'm a Chinese journalist and my English name is Tai. So based on your arguments, do you think that the current UN negotiation about reducing carbon emissions is a tool used by the developed world to delay or to deter the development of the developing countries in the third world? Thank you.
If you don't mind, we'll just take, if you hand the mic to you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Wiltshire. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. I believe that Howard Friel has written a book called The Lomborg Deception, and in which he claims to rubbish many of your calculations. I'm interested in what your response is about that whole debate, and also what you think of the fact that being contrarian pays. So Howard's book is sort of contrary to your claims, and your claims were originally contrary to apparent consensus. So I'm interested in what you think, and if it's dangerous that the fact that being contrarian pays.
Do you have any questions there? Is it used to, I'm sorry, I need to know, do you believe the developed world use it to delay developing world?
Yeah, I think so, maybe economically.
Yeah.
Do you mean deliberately, or just that will be a
maybe that will be a side effect, but somebody think about this. Okay, maybe they won't say it on the table, but it could be an avoidable result because to transit to a low carbon economy, but it's not very suitable for some developing countries at this moment.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with you. I think there's a lot of other agendas going on from a lot of different parties. I always think of the French. They basically want to get a lot of basically try to curtail the WTO and keep work inside their own borders by saying we should tax things that come from the outside, for instance from China and other places that haven't signed up to a very extensive carbon cutting regime. Which of course is very easy when you're France or when you're Sweden that produces a lot of their energy from nuclear. But there's lots of those kinds of arguments. But again, as I started out saying, my sense is when you talk to most of the people who are sort of the Al Gore types, it's not because they want to, they have sinister back motives. Honestly, I think they just want to make for a better world. And so the discussion is much more, are you actually achieving that? And even if that's not true, or even if you don't buy into that, I think the discussion is much aided if we don't start questioning each other's motives, to simply talk to, all right, listen, I respect you, I think you want, no, not you, but, well, I do respect you, but I'm not trying to talk to you, but I respect my opponent, and I believe that he or she wants to do good, but now let's talk about, are you actually achieving that through your policies? And then, getting into the conversation that way, I think that's a much more helpful way. With respect to how Friedel, I don't know how you pronounce his name either. He never contacted me for his book, which I find somewhat surprising. I've written a long response to that you can download from my webpage, Lomborg.com. Fundamentally, he accuses me of being very one-sided, sloppy with my references, misstating my references, all that kind of stuff. And fundamentally, I find that that's exactly what Friedel has said. Now, that's not very, even if I was guilty of all what he said, that would probably be what you'd expect me to say as well. But I think if you take a look at some of the things I've tried to point out that he's done, I think it's simply it's a hit job. I find it somewhat depressing because I really want to welcome both debate and conversation about this. This is why I make a lot of effort to, for instance, when I do references, I always put on page numbers, which a lot of people just reference the whole book, and you're like, how do I know whether that's true or not? I say on this page, that's where they say it. And so, it strikes me, there's one example, just to give you very briefly, I discuss how very often you don't talk about cold deaths, but only heat deaths. And then I quote 3 studies that show that 2 of which explicitly say we're not going to look at cold deaths. And then I say, well, but there are the 2 other studies that have looked at this and actually indicate that cold deaths might actually outweigh heat deaths. And then they all quote it at the end of that of a paragraph, those 5 studies, and then he says, 3 of Lomborg's 5 quotes don't include cold deaths. And I'm like, that was the point. That was the exact point that I was making in the sentences just before. And it's fine. You inevitably make mistakes, and of course I also make mistakes. So if that was just one thing that Howard Friedel had done, that's fine. But it's that sort of constant misreading of what I say that I find quite depressing, actually. About the contrarian, whether it pays, I'm not quite sure, and correct me if I'm answering your question wrong, but I think it's incredibly important that we have these sort of contrary voices, because it's very, very easy to get caught up in believing this is the one way to think about the world. I don't know if you guys remember acid rain in the 1980s. I always remember Greenpeace. I thought really the world was coming to an end for a lot of different reasons, but acid rain was clearly one of them. And Die Stern predicted that all Europe's forest would be gone in 2000, that kind of stuff. It was perhaps useful to say, hey, wait a minute. It turned out, as it does very often, there is something about acid rain, and it does affect very vulnerable ecological areas, and perhaps even more lakes, for instance, Norway and Sweden. But fundamentally, it was a much overblown argument. And it's necessary to have those corrections, because otherwise we'll just go off like lemmings in one area and forget about oligos.
I'm afraid we are completely out of time now. Bjorn, you've been absolutely fascinating, very, very stimulating questions and provocations, a great sort of challenge to, I think, the sort of quite a sort of often lazy consensus. What you were just talking about the rule of people to ask questions and to question consensus is exactly what you've been doing so kindly this evening. I think all of us will want to give you a very large round of applause.